Today we're going to talk about evolution as a scientific theory. I'll take you through the exciting world of Charles Darwin and his idea, how he came to his idea. This will include his field research along with his inspiration from other scientists. I want to run down some of the common misconceptions about evolution, but first, let's talk about science. Science is an approach to understanding, a way of knowing. The field is dedicated to answering questions and finding the truth about the natural world. A scientific theory is an explanation based on facts that has been confirmed through observation and experimentation. All science supports statements with evidence, but an important thing to remember is that a hypothesis only evolves into a theory when it is supported with a tremendous amount of evidence. Let me tell you a couple of things that evolution is not. Evolution is not a myth. There are mounds of evidence backing up the theory of evolution. Second, evolution is not saying that humans came from apes. Third, evolution does not ignore any found data or bits of the fossil record. Finally, evolution is not survival of the fittest when fit means most strong or best fighter. Fitness is defined in biology as the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce. Let's back up. Aristotle, who lived from 384 BC to around 322 BC, came up with the idea of scala naturae, the idea that life can be arranged in order of increasing complexity with a ladder-type layout. Later, Carl Linnaeus lived 1707 to 1778, created the binomial naming system of organisms and the nested classification idea. This is where we get many of the modern names such as Homo sapien. James Hutton, 1726 to 1797, came up with the theory that geological features have been formed by gradual mechanisms. A good example would be the formation of valleys by rivers over time. Later, Charles Lyell, 1797 to 1875, came up with the theory that geological features are still caused by gradual mechanisms, and that even now, the same processes are occurring. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, 1744 to 1829, came up with the theory of use and disuse, that the more an organism uses a trait, the stronger it will become, and the less it uses a trait, the weaker it will become, the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics, and the theory that organisms have the innate drive to be complex. Alfred Russel Wallace, 1823 to 1913, reached out to Darwin about his theories of natural selection after doing many years of research of his own. When the two discovered their findings were remarkably similar, they published together. After this, Charles Darwin, 1808 to 1882, published his book on the origin of species, which he described as a short abstract of his findings over his years of research. Charles Darwin's inspiration was mostly founded on his journey with Captain Robert Fitzroy on the HMS Beagle. The two set off on the Beagle in 1831. During their journey, Darwin observed and collected many species of plants and animals, focusing on their characteristics that made them fit to live in their environment. These adaptations were seen in finches and mockingbirds on the Galapagos Islands. Not only were the animals' beaks adapted depending on available food, but also their behaviors. He concluded that the adaptation for inheritable traits that will allow an organism to survive and reproduce indicates a force of natural selection. By 1840, Darwin was beginning to work out his hypothesis and the structure of his work. In 1844, he finally decided to begin to write on his findings from the Beagle, mostly focusing on natural selection as a means for descent with modification. Remember we talked about Wallace earlier? Well, he and Darwin had both read the work of Thomas Malthus in his essay on populations, which pretty much said that populations tend to increase faster than their resources. In 1858, Wallace reached out to Darwin about his findings in the South Pacific. He had come up with a theory of natural selection that was similar to Darwin's. After co-publishing a paper with Wallace in 1858, Darwin published his abstract on the origin of species in 1859. Variation under domestication. Darwin rejected the ideas that only environmental factors trigger variation and that habits of use trigger variation at all. He sets up the idea that sexual reproduction is the main cause for variation, since traits have to be passed on to offspring. He introduces the processes of conscious selection and the practice of domestic breeders and unconscious selection, which happens in nature without influence. Variation under nature. In the second chapter, Variation Under Nature, Darwin continues his discussion of variation at a broader level. He reiterates that variation caused by environmental conditions aren't inherited, just like they aren't in domestic animals. In any given biosphere, there are dominant and non-dominant species. By Chapter 3, he set up a good foundation in the importance of and factors in variation. Darwin begins to give examples about how certain variations can allow animals to survive, to fight the struggle for existence. This is where the Malthus theory comes into play. Besides having a competition for resources, there are also natural disasters to factor in. The idea of natural selection plays off the concept of breeders selecting certain desirable traits to breed. Think of natural selection as a method for the passing of traits that are desirable or efficient to keep the animal alive and able to reproduce. It's natural in the sense that it happens in nature without the assistance of a breeder. Some of the variation within species include those due to use or disuse of traits or organs. If an organism does not use something, it will eventually go away. Some ground birds can't fly, but they still have feathers, and at the same time, birds and insects that do fly might have larger or stronger wings. These are traits that will help the animal to survive. All these traits must be inheritable. Some variations, such as eye color, seem to be useless to their host organism. Such variations will also occur in organs that the species uses most. Darwin also points out that his theory has several complications. One of these is the question of species. He asks why we have individual species instead of different forms of species. He also wondered why species have such complex organs if they come from species that are much simpler. He answered these questions using his theories of natural selection, which would kill off the intermediate species. The main thing to take away from Chapter 7 is the difference of habit and instinct. Habit is learned behavior, while instinct is inherited. Instinct is innate. Although a habit exhibited by a parent can be picked up by offspring, it's not passed through genetics. Darwin also points out that hybrid species are often sterile. He attributes this to the improper cross of two reproductive systems. This means that the fertility of the offspring does not determine whether the parents are from the same species. He claims that the other scientists are wrong in assuming the opposite based on reproductive systems because they did not know enough about it at the time. One may ask, how do we know Darwin? Well, there's a lot of things. He spoke on one of the more important ones, the fossil record. Darwin admitted that the fossil record isn't good enough proof because the fossil record is flawed. He argues that since the Earth has undergone so many changes, we may have lost some of the fossils of the intermediate species. So there you go. In his chapter on geological succession of organic beings, Darwin explains the mechanisms of descent with modification, which we like to call evolution. We know that the formation of new species takes a long time, and new species eventually replace the old species. Depending on the species, some take longer to evolve than others. According to Darwin's theory, modern species will be more complex. It ties geology into this chapter by noting that parallel succession exists, which is pretty much the idea that landforms and species can develop at the same time in different places around the globe. Have you heard the phrase in housing that it's location, location, location? The same works for evolution. There are 3 ideas to location. 1. Organisms are similar based on location. It's just going to happen that depending on the environment, certain adaptations will arise. 2nd and 3rd, isolation and migration. These 2 factors play a huge role in evolution. In isolated environments, like an island, species become very distinct and change based on their environment, while species that are able to migrate and meet new species play just as big a part in the environment. Nowadays, scientists have a lot more evidence that allows them to connect species, a few of which included the fossil record. Organisms both living and extinct can leave behind fossils. Geographic distribution, organisms that are similar based on location. Homologous structures, similar structures from common ancestry, some vestigial. Developmental similarities. We look the same as a lot of other species while we're developing. And finally, and most importantly, the use of DNA. So next time somebody tells you that evolution is the belief that we came from apes, simply smile and say, "Oh no dear, evolution is change over time." Evolution is a scientific theory. It's backed up with evidence and it's really awesome.